Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral, traditional, unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and it's a real honor to be on this land and to have this space to share and learn from one another. I hope your sound is okay, everybody. I'd like to remind everyone joining us today that sometimes the subject matter that we talk about on the UBC Learning Circle may be triggering or potentially sensitive for you, and so we really encourage everybody to have a support network in place for yourself. That can be somebody that you trust that you can talk to, or a counselor, or a crisis line number, but please feel free to take space for yourself today for self-care. My name is Miranda Kelly. I'm Stalo from Sexuality First Nation, and I'm really honored to be the education coordinator for the UBC Learning Circle and to be hosting today's session on the empowerment of Aboriginal women with Dr. Rosalind Ng. She is a member of the Apasquayak Cree Nation in Manitoba and has lived in BC for 34 years. She earned her degrees at the University of British Columbia. Her research focused on the impacts of residential school, where she spent 11 years. She works on behalf of First Nations in BC. She's taught at the Native Education College and then at UBC as a coordinator in the First Nations Health Careers, and recently was a signer of the 2nd Richmond School District 38 Aboriginal Education Enhancement Agreement. She has always loved learning, reading, art, music, and traveling. She believes education gives one confidence to stand up for social justice, equality, empower others to live a healthy life, and to achieve dreams with goals. She received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012 for her work in Aboriginal education and community contributions. And she has 2 sons and a granddaughter. So welcome, Rosalind, so much. Thank you for joining us today. And for those of you on video conference, as we go through the presentation, if you have any comments or questions, you can take yourself off of mute. Looks like we have 4 different locations joining us today by video conference. And on webinar, we have 47 participants right now. Thanks for everyone who's joining us. Feel free to introduce yourself and where you're from using the chat box. And you can also type in your questions or comments throughout the presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Ng.
Thank you, Miranda. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Miranda, for recognition of the nations that are on unceded territories here in Vancouver. And also want to thank the the sponsors of the First Nations Health Authority, and also the UBC Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health in the School of Population and Public Health. And I especially, of course, want to thank the UBC Learning Circle staff for making this possible and asking me to be with you today. And most of all, I want to thank the frontline workers in our communities who care for all the people there. And thank you to Davina for your help in formatting and getting this presentation together. I appreciate it. I want to invite you all to come on this little journey. It's taken me a lifetime to travel, and it's an honor to share my experience with you today on this topic, the empowerment of Aboriginal women. And it simply means that I'm giving myself permission to change my life. So I'll use the slides as I share this journey. Okay, the presentation will include these topics. Education gives intellectual tools and skills. It gives cultural meaning, which is fundamental to who we are and where you come from. sharing some of my experience on how traveling and living in other countries enriched my life. Topic 4, family relations and motherhood, which we can all relate to. And lastly, giving inspiration from having a spiritual foundation for successful living. So first of all, what is empowerment? There's a dictionary definition and some examples that I took out of my dictionary. It's authority or power given to someone to do something. So a quote, individuals are given empowerment to create their own destiny, their own sociological, psychological, political, whatever change in their life. And it's also the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's right in the way you want to live. A definition in a sentence would be sociological, political, and cultural steps are necessary for the empowerment of Aboriginal women. Now, there's another way that you can approach it, empowerment for healthy choices in living. And this is a process in health promotion through which people gain greater control over decisions and actions affecting their health or their lifestyle. And it can be socially, culturally, psychologically, or politically. So Aboriginal women can express their needs, concerns, and achieve social and cultural actions to meet those needs. That is, you can empower yourself. One of the many ways that we can do this is through education. I left residential school when I was just beginning grade 11, and I always regretted that I wasn't able to finish school because I loved learning. However, I was going to be moved to another residential school. It would have been my 4th one, and I wasn't prepared to make another big adjustment like that in my life, and so I left. And I was 16. I found out actually too that summer that I didn't even have to be in residential school because I was 16. So one of the ways that I did learn to educate myself was through reading. And reading is really so important to children, and I hope that you'll take the initiative to guide them and read to them more, because for this reason here, children are born ready to learn. We all know that, we watch our babies grow and they learn so much in the first year of their lives. So they cultivate actually 85% of their intellect and their personality and skills by the time they're age 5. So the first months and years of life, they set the stage for lifelong development. And that was taken from the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families, Brain Development, the early years. And there is also a moral value in education. And I just put this little quote, I just sort of try to lighten it up a little bit. So don't educate your children to be rich. Educate them to be happy, so they know the value of things, not the price. And I'm so proud of a lot of our Aboriginal students in our universities that they go to school to help their communities and to be an example to their communities, and they don't really focus that much on how much money they can make when they graduate. So you need to stimulate your child's cognitive development by reading to them at an early age. I used to use magazines, animals, pictures, trees, flowers, anything that's colorful, and I put it on the wall near the crib. For the longest time I had a big picture of an orange that was cut in half, and it had beautiful texture, And my kids used to look at it and actually mumble away at it. So, you know, they are learning and paying a lot of attention to things around them. So I held my children, they looked at books with pictures on them and the names under each item, and I would go through all of them, and at the end of some session I would ask, well, where's the stove, where is the ladle, and where is the bowl, or where is the school? And they, you know, before they were even one, you know, this was when they were about 9 or 10, they could point at all these pictures. It just blew my mind. So that's what I did. They're learning all the time, and so start at infancy to read to them. I used to buy these cloth books for them to hold, and most of the time it was in their mouth, but still they held it, and sometimes they would open it and look at it. Nothing you do to stimulate them to love learning is better than reading to them. And you'll find that progress is magical. You know, once they learn to read in school, they want to read to you, so you have to be patient and allow them to do that at the end of the day. Okay, it is not what you do for your children, but what you have taught them to do for themselves that will make them successful human beings. And we try to do so much for them, but really they always want to do their own things most of the time. So as we progress in life, adults who have been read to as children will love reading. And it's important as adults because reading is necessary because you learn to recognize what good writing looks like. You see the grammar, the sentence structure, the paragraph structure, punctuation, such as quotation marks when people speak, and so on. And also, if you read much, you write well, and increase your vocabulary continually. Writing is the only way your thinking can be assessed, and this is so important when you go to school. In elementary, high school, and university, you are always being graded on your ability to write well as you learn to write logically. So I noticed when I was teaching that all the students who read were the ones who wrote well, and many were at a disadvantage at the Native Education Center in writing because they hadn't been readers and their parents didn't read to them when they were young. So encourage your children to form good reading habits and read to them in their early years. But reading is also for enjoyment and learning. We don't have to learn everything from a textbook or in a school setting. But in high school or university, your recommended and your required readings give you the additional background to the lectures that will help you in your writing for your essays, your papers, or any discussions. And you learn critical thinking skills to address injustices and criticism about your life. No one has all the answers, so your opinions count as they affect you, not those who are your critics. So you make good choices to value education and learn to forget the past and live in control of the present for the better future for yourself and children. And we learn such things as well, just an example how the Indian Act was imposed on us and how we are bound by it. And always remember that our ancestors never asked for this oppressive act. It's a piece of legislation stating who is an Indian, and this is a dichotomy that we have to sort of learn to separate, because in a way, having that piece of legislation is racist, but at the same time it's a protection because it was really the only legal document at the time that stated who was an Indian. And we need that for protection in quite a few ways. cultural knowledge. Who are you? And it's really important that you know that, know yourself. What are your strengths, and who taught you these strengths? Well, we have culture, and culture is handed down in many ways, and mostly in my generation it was through ancestral teachings. A lot of storytelling went on, so we had to honor the legends you've heard, and gradually over time you learn to process the meaning of those stories, because they can have multiple meanings. So look at the art you see in your village. You know, BC people, I admire them so much, because when I first came here, I was just fascinated with all the totem poles and the art and the longhouses and so on, and I thought you were so lucky to have withstood the onslaught of cultural destruction by having all of these artifacts and art preserved for you in your villages by your elders and the artists. As an example, when you see the art in your villages, Haida, they were so strong in protecting their lands at the time in the 1800s. They didn't want people coming in digging for gold or taking their trees down. And so in 1862, the government actually turned smallpox loose on them by purposely not inoculating them. And so the first small wave of smallpox decimated whole villages, because you only probably need 1 or 2 people to be infected, and it can just go through the whole village. It's so contagious. So many did not survive. But some carvers, such as Charles Edensaw, survived. And here's a quote from Jimmy Hart. Recently he carved the reconciliation pole, and it was raised here at UBC just about 3 weeks ago. And I hope sometime you'll get a chance to come out to UBC and see this magnificent pole that tells such a story and the toll it took on the lives of many children. Here's what he says about it. Carving was and is our way of writing, recording history, showing our prerogatives, our stories, our beliefs, our religion. We must carry on in the hideaway, but it would apply to all other nations. We owe it to our ancestors who created and left us this grand legacy of high art, our history. We owe it to our future generations to fuel them to carry on with pride and dignity with the will of our people. That was taken out of an art book that was part of the Edensaw collection that was on view at the Vancouver Art Gallery a couple of years ago. And I hope you get a chance to sometimes go and view a lot of this art that's here at the Museum of Anthropology, and also the Vancouver Museum has a wonderful collection, and of course the Vancouver Art Gallery. So part of our culture includes longhouse practices. So you see what you do every day. That's culture. It's how we live and pass on knowledge. It includes how we speak our languages, the songs that we sing and the dances that we perform, how we can our foods, such as salmon, and how we store foods as well. And it includes gatherings, feasts, potlatches, giveaways, and the lesson that we hand down is that we learn to share our wealth. And so art is a concrete example of culture. The abstract ones are, the values that we have, how we storytell, and how we teach our children to conduct themselves respectfully. And I think the role of children really is, their only responsibility is how to be obedient and listen and learn. So our artists in our communities should be honored more, as they really contribute enormously to the creativity of our nations. And their art represents the strength, honor, and dignity of each of our nations. So always act proudly. You know, we have a lot to be proud of. We have endured so much. And our ancestors, I still marvel at how my grandparents, you know, they were always so kind, and always, they were never rude to people who treated them with disrespect on the streets. And they always told us, don't become like them, you know. So I think, you know, we have to be thankful for how brave and strong they were. So know your strengths. Weaknesses, you know, as you find, are always what people notice first. They criticize you, but sometimes we have to learn why as well and be humble about it. But if it's not worth dwelling on, just ignore the criticism, because your happiness is more important. So unhealthy behaviors we grew up with in residential schools where we had no parental guidance, I think are really a very bad legacy that we got from residential schools. We really just copied each other in the behaviors that went on, and if the staff criticized us, which they always did, and it was never in a kind way, we would just use the same words that these supervisors used, and we would use it to taunt our little friends. We didn't know any better, you know, that our parents weren't around to guide us. And I think that's a holdover still in our communities, and I would really like to have people really notice the type of behavior that you yourself project, and how others behave to each other. Because I think there's nothing really more destructive in our communities than not having a positive attitude, and some of the gossip that goes around. It's not healthy, and it's not, doesn't create happiness in our communities. So we should learn to offer positive comments to those who succeed. Remember that they worked hard to achieve it. When you see the students at university here, what a difficult time they used to have. I worked at the Longhouse for 10 years, so I was really always observing students and trying to help with them. But sometimes they would run out of food, and you know, in their kindness and sharing, they would hold potlatches and bring whatever food they had in their apartment. Sometimes it was crackers, you know, a piece of bread, or, you know, they just brought it and shared it so that they would not be hungry. And, you know, they worked really hard to attain their goals and graduate. You can also be a successful leader and a role model if you have a worthy self-concept, you know, of who you are. It's really important to know that. My mother and father, my father's name is John Young, and my mother was Elizabeth Jane Bignell Young. We're from the Beaver clan in the Opaskwayak Nation. Opaskwayak used to be called the Paw in northern Manitoba. Many of you have probably heard it called by that, but our leadership, our chiefs and councillor, about 15-20 years ago decided that they would go back to calling our community Opaskwayak, which was what it was always known as before. So, you know, that's taking a positive action to reclaim a lot of the culture that we lost through the residential school period. So being a successful leader and learning how to empower yourself first, and then acting as a role model, you can really help move forward in your communities. So culture heals and gives meaning for empowerment every day. I think if I hadn't come to BC, I might have gone somewhere else, maybe Ontario, back to Ottawa, where we seem to always end up. But I learned so much when I came to British Columbia in 1984. I had been away from my culture for many years because my husband spent 32 years in the military, so we were always moving around, and I think once I came across another First Nations person. He was a pilot in the Air Force, and his family, they had 5 children. But that was the only time I ever ran across another First Nations person in the Air Force and the military. So I was, after leaving residential school at age 17 and then leaving my home at age 18, I never really had much to do with my community or living as a First Nations person, because I went into the Air Force at age 18 and then married my husband and he stayed in for 32 years, and I came here to BC, and my eyes were just open. I just felt so proud for how the elders here had preserved the culture and what they were doing. I was working at the Aboriginal Friendship Center at the time, and we used to have elders come and talk to the people there once a week, and I learned so much from them. And I became proud of being a First Nations person again, because you know how at residential school we were always shamed, and I never felt worthy, and I guess I really worked hard to divest myself of being Cree by the time I left residential school. It was, I knew that a large part of my life was missing, but I couldn't pinpoint why until I came here and I realized that I was missing all this culture, and I did recognize many of the teachings that were being taught at the time when I worked at the Friendship Center. So at residential school, we were damaged, as young children. I went when I was 5, and my sisters, they went when they were only 3. And so, you really don't learn to develop good interpersonal relationship skills, and also it really does compromise your ability to act out your strengths as you mature. But healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. We can never forget what residential schools did to us. But it does mean that the damage can no longer control our lives. We shouldn't let residential schools define us anymore. But also, of course, we'll never forget, and we have to remember all of those who didn't survive residential school. I had 2 young friends who died when I was there, and that was really difficult because, I was only 7 and the other one was 9 at the time. And I couldn't believe, how merciless people could be. And I always remember Barney Williams, he's a New Channel elder. When he finishes any speech he makes about residential school and his work in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the last 7 years, and he still does, he always ends up by saying, "We were brave children." And it's, that's really true when I look back. So here we are talking about my experience in the travel, how it enhanced my life. I think learning about other places and people, that empowered me so much, especially when I went to live in the United States. We went to live in Washington, D.C. when my husband was going to university there, and I met these women in our church, and they were all so educated. They had PhDs, they were lawyers and doctors, and I had never met women who were professional. and so I really wanted, to start working on my education. And after we left Washington and went to Ottawa, I did start going back and upgrading my skills. I took a test, and my math grade was at a grade 5 level, and I knew that. I stopped learning when I was in grade 5 at residential school. But I always maintained my reading, and I had a grade 12 assessment on my reading at the time when I decided to go back and upgrade so I could go to university. But I learned about places of interest that through my reading. I learned how to love art by looking at all the pictures in these art books and the architecture as well. And then later on, when my husband and I were living overseas, when we traveled, the destination was always where the art was that we wanted to see. So I lived in these provinces: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, Germany, Belgium, Italy, British Columbia, and I left out Washington, D.C. It was too long to fit in that lot. Anyway, you do learn to become adaptive to all sorts of environments and learn the history of places and people. And I also had to learn French when I lived in Belgium. I had taken some of it when I was in Canada before as well, so I had a pretty good grammar background. And then in Germany, when I lived there, I felt so isolated when I went out with my son looking at the billboards, and I couldn't read what any of them said, so I started learning German, but I also needed to know how to shop. So I learned to speak German as well. So let's see, I can show you, well, here's something. Maya Angelou, I don't know if you have read her books, but she wrote beautiful books. She was a black lady. She just died, I think, about a year or two ago. And my favorite book of hers is Why I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And it talks about her struggle through the years as a black person in America. But she talks about travel, and I like this quote: "Perhaps travel cannot prevent bigotry, but by demonstrating that all people cry, laugh, eat, worry, and die, it can introduce the idea that if we try and understand each other, we may even become friends." And that's what traveling and reading does for you. It does enhance your horizons and understanding as well. Here are some places I love. Lake Louise in Alberta. I love that lake. I've gone there several times because I lived in Alberta as well for a couple of years. And the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in the Vatican. I was able to see this twice. The first time I saw it, it was very dingy, and it wasn't very clear because of all the smoke from the candles that they burn, and so it damages, I guess, the colors and so on, and all the smoke clings to it. So they were starting to clean it when I first went there, but just a small portion of it, but you could see what a difference it made. And then the next time I went back, it was all, it was like this, that beautiful blue that's there. It wasn't that vivid before. And this is kind of the way people have fun when they're traveling. At the Leaning Tower of Pisa, a lot of these young people, that's what they do. The tower is quite a ways from this fence that's there, but they stand up on the fence and they angle their camera so that it's touching, the foot is touching the tower, and then they snap the picture and it looks like you're trying to knock it down. There's many ways that they have fun doing that. And this is the Thunderbird Park in Victoria, BC. Anyway, this is Mungo Martin's longhouse there on the grounds of the BC Museum. The inside of it is like a regular longhouse, and when my nephew graduated with his master's from the University of Victoria, they had their graduation there. And Mungo Martin, of course, was revered really by both First Nations and even the Euro-Canadians in Victoria. When he died, they actually took his body through the Inside Passage on a boat up to his home community to be buried there. So artists, they really have been instrumental in bringing a lot of the history of our people and how it survived and how people endured through the very difficult times of early Canada. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. I couldn't believe I actually was there. I mean, I told my traveling companions that here I am, a young girl that grew up on a reserve and went to residential school, and here I am in Russia at this, they called it the Winter Palace, but it's now a Hermitage Museum and full of art and long alleyways and hallways of art everywhere. Just amazing. Now we're into family relationships and motherhood. Here's a nice little picture. Believe in children. There is faith in their eyes, love in their eyes, and love in their touch, kindness in their gestures. Thrill with them at life's big and small moments. Hold them close, because from small beginnings come great things. And you know how much children trust us and depend on us when they're young. And we can learn so much about tenderness and love just from them, holding them and watching them grow up. And one of the other things that we worry about what they're going to become, but don't worry that children never listen to you. My kids always, it seemed, were talking back to me and so on, but always telling me, "You're not the boss, Mommy." But worry that they are always watching you. One of the things I used to tell some of my families that came to the Aboriginal Friendship Center was that always be careful what they did in front of their children. I said, never do anything in front of your children that you wouldn't do. Because, immediately you do something, they'll turn around and do it or say it. And here's a quote from this Mrs. Kennedy. If you bungle raising your children, I don't think that whatever else you do matters very much. And I think, we should always be aware and keep that in the back of our minds, how much responsibility we have. And it's one of the most sacred responsibilities that we'll ever have in the different roles that we have. So there are many ways that you can achieve healthy relationships that will help empower you, because if you empower yourself, you're also empowering your children. So we, as parents, we have a sacred path to travel through our whole lifetime. So, you're a parent forever. I'm still doing things for my 50-year-old son. And, you never stop. And not that I mind either. Children are our future. That's a culture of teaching we've heard. So we're responsible for building a strong foundation for our children, because they need good self-esteem and self-confidence to become independent eventually. And as I mentioned, even though our intellect is developed 85% 5% before age 4, it's only one factor of successful learning and living. There's all kinds of skills that they have to learn and know along with the intellect that they've developed. One of the things they need is age-appropriate tasks, and this was really very common in my father's lifetime. He used to talk about the things that he had to do when he was a young boy. He still had to go and carry water from the river because that's how we didn't have electricity or running water on our reserve. And all the children were given little buckets to go down to the river to and bring water up. But they still knew they had to do this. And the age-appropriate behaviors that we're expecting them to conduct themselves, they have to learn. We have to learn to give them choices, but at the same time, teach them to live with the consequences of the choice that they've made. So, and if you do all for them, they never get to experience the satisfaction of success. So always encourage them to become independent. And, they can learn to do a lot of things that take risks, but that's part of the learning process. And we must teach them, to respect everybody. So if a child is allowed to be disrespectful to his parents, he or she will not have true respect for anyone else. So that's really very important to cultivate that value very early in our children's lives. So some of the tasks that as parents we should always try to practice. We need to supervise homework and start early and continue to high school, because you teach them how to have good study habits. And you need good study habits in any education that you pursue. You have to learn to be disciplined and to do these tasks. They're necessary for success. And one of the things I find in Richmond, where I live, it's getting better, but it's difficult getting the parent to come to parent-teacher interviews. And I know that's all from our experience at residential schools. But as I said before, don't let residential school define you. Teachers are wonderful. I think in a lot of ways my learning was from teachers who were good and respected me as a student. Were the ones that motivated me to go to higher education. And your children want you to go and speak to their teachers, and if you don't go, they're very disappointed, and sometimes they feel stigmatized by it from their other little classmates. And when they bring home report cards, be positive about the comments, even if you think their mark isn't good enough, but just ask them, maybe the next time, instead of having a C minus, let's work for a C plus, and I'll help you do it. We used to hold spelling matches in our house for our children when they were growing up. Once a week we would do this, and because they always got a list from the school on the words that they were going to be quizzed on at the end of the week. And they always were the only ones that, one of them was the only one that went the whole year without any spelling mistakes, and my oldest son made a spelling mistake once, so he didn't get the prize. But, just little competitions like that encourage them to want to do better and to do more. So talk openly and honestly about sexuality. Don't make them feel ashamed, because this is a normal process of growing up. They're going to learn anyway, so I think it's better that you instruct them in ways that you want them to learn, and use age-appropriate language for them when questions are raised. They need healthy concepts of a normal function. I used to tell my children they didn't really understand for quite a while that their daddy and I, we love each other, so we have a sexual relationship. And they didn't really know that, but until later on they started asking questions about what that really meant. And so it was, a teaching time then. Now, homosexuality is out in the open now, and I'm glad, because my young son, is gay as well. And, we raised our children and told them that we love them unconditionally, so they could come to us for anything. I mean, they still did a lot of things behind our backs, as most kids will do, but they grew up knowing that they could bring anything to us, and we discuss it and help them through it. So we have to face that and just say sometimes boys like boys and girls like girls until they understand what they need to know at their age. So the real work of empowering ourselves, of course, begins at home. It's our responsibility. And this is about loving your children unconditionally. If you want to change the world, go home and give love to your family. Now, we all know how residential school did a lot of damage to us emotionally and physically, unable to demonstrate affection. And that takes a while, but I think this generation, is seeing more of that. I mean, everywhere you go now, people hug. At one time, you used to shake hands, and that was the norm, but now people hug most of the time. So I think we're getting a lot of practice in how to be affectionate, and the impact that has on people. Sometimes they really need a hug, but our children definitely need that affection, and you have to begin it in the home. We didn't have that at residential school. I don't ever remember getting a hug from anybody, no matter how much I hurt. They just seemed to not touch you at all. And I think most of our generation grew up that way. But it doesn't need to be that way. I mean, when you really love a person, you want to hold them, you want to touch and kiss. So don't withdraw yourself from your loved ones. This is my family. I'm Cree, I said, and I come from a family of, we had 15 children, and here there was 4, but there's 3 sets of twins in this picture. And one of the babies died when she was only 9 months old, but in those days, I think the infant mortality rate was about 1 in 10 babies. So I think just about every family on our reserve that had large families had one death, of an infant. That's my mother and my father. And these are the 3 sets of twins in my family. Doris and Bester Young, they're still teaching. They're in their 70s, but they're still teaching. They both have their master's degrees. And my brother Ken and Mariah, my brother Ken is a lawyer, and he was one of the legal experts that was instrumental in bringing about the common, what is it, CCP, what is it? Well, anyway, the residential school money that we got, I think it was $3,000 for every year that you spent in residential school, and then the other part where the children that were badly abused sexually and physically were also able to get a lot of compensation for their mental abuse and sexual abuse. So that's what he did, as an adult. And the 2 babies there, the one died, the one on the right, when she was only 9 months old. and the four people in the middle there are those adults. They were the babies that you saw there, and the small ones. And this is a picture of my father. One year he took a bunch of young soccer players to Europe. They started out in Sweden and worked their way down from Holland down into Germany and ended up in Italy at in the Vatican and met John Paul II. So he this was a thrill of his lifetime, but we're not really Catholics because we're Anglicans, but he still felt that it was an honor for the Pope actually wanted to meet the team because they were also traveling with a Catholic priest, and he made all the arrangements. And my father, he was really our role model and our tower of strength, because my mother died when we were all pretty young. And so we depended on him for just everything, emotionally. And so I like this quote because I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. You need both parents. I know in our communities there's a lot of very young, I think really too young, single parents. But we need to help them more. I think we need to teach them more about the responsibilities of sexual activity. Because I guess there's a reason why we're taught not to have sex too early, and it's because we're not mature enough to take on the role of a parent. You need a lot of help, being a parent, and I think when you have two people, a father and a mother helping, that takes a lot of the strain and burden of child caring. But if you're a single parent and you're not even near your parents to help you, I just cannot think of anything, that can require more attention by people in our communities, and that's to help single parents with their children. This was a wedding. My sister, or my niece, the one in the wedding gown, she was married a couple of years ago. These are my nieces and nephews there. Just sharing some things about my family here. And that picture I showed you about my family in a row there, the one on the right, Marcel, wasn't born. He was born 3 years later, so I wanted to, include him because there's a story behind him as well. He got his medical doctor degree, and he had to go to the States because he applied for 3 universities in Canada, and McGill and McMaster and the University of Manitoba, and he wasn't accepted at any of those schools. Even in our province, like Manitoba, the University of Manitoba rejected him. And he had good grades. He already had a bachelor and a master in physical education, so he had a good background, and he was a teacher. But he applied to that program they have in the States, Indians into Medicine, and they accepted him. So he went down to the States and got his medical doctor degree. And he set up a practice in Maginot, North Dakota. And that's his son, Zane, who's also graduated in this picture with his medical doctor degree. Now Zane came up here as a summer science student because I was here, and he really loved UBC, so he came back and took his science degree here, ag sciences though, because he always liked to garden, and so he wanted to learn more about organic farming, and so he was in the ag sciences, and they accepted him to do his master's, but he decided not to pursue his master's at that time. But now he did go back in North Dakota and got his doctor degree, and then now he's in his 3rd year of vascular surgery at Rochester, New York. And his mother, Vivian, she's from my reserve too. she's working on her PhD in linguistics. So the value of education, was really always emphasized in my family by my father. And my mother was deeply hurt by residential school, so she refused to speak English even after she left, so we were always forced to speak Cree to her. And that was a good thing, because we did learn to maintain the language through that. And now Vivian is studying linguistics in the Cree language as well. And this is my son, Ted and Sasha. I shared with you that he's gay, and they're two in the middle, and that's my husband and I on the right, and then his mother and dad on the left. And this wedding was in Berlin 2 years ago. So that was, a wonderful gathering. And I wanted to show you this because, there were sometimes difficult years at residential schools, but they were also very helpful and kind in many ways too, as we progressed in age, because we could learn to defend ourselves, at least speaking back and so on, and pointing out what we thought were the injustices and them being so mean to us. So my sister, there in the middle, and her husband, they grew up in residential schools. And when they were both working at the residential school in Prince Albert at the time, and so they got married, and the staff put on this beautiful wedding for them. They made the cake and so on. The minister on the left was Reverend Grace. He married them. That's me in the blue. I was 16. And the one in this uniform there, they grew up together in residential schools. Lawrence, he came out of the army, or took leave to come to the wedding as the best man. And the couple on the right, Mr. and Mrs. Tuthill, I remember them years ago at a residential school I went to in Elkhorn, Manitoba. I was 6, but I still always remember them being there. So my sister thought that, they would be good to ask as the mother and dad of the groom, because my father couldn't afford to travel there to give her away. And 2 summers ago, this picture appeared in Facebook. The APTN wanted to know if anybody knew who these people were, because they said that they went to residential school, but they don't know who they are. So this went all across Canada, and people, some of them finally, it was the grandchildren, my sister's grandson, that recognized him right away and said, "That's my grandpa and my grandma." And so other people, did recognize us eventually. So I thought that was quite interesting. Here's my granddaughter, Nimkish. She's, quite different from how we grew up. She's so happy and outgoing, and she has a lot of friends who really adore her. And it's such a different childhood than what we had at residential school. And that's her daddy in the middle, Greg, my son. Greg Young-Ying, he's a professor in Indigenous Studies at the Okanagan UBC campus. That's my husband on the left. And I went to his grad that day. In my family, we do value education, and my husband has 2 degrees, Greg has 4 degrees, I have 3 degrees, and my son, so between the 4 of us, we have 10 degrees in just that family, but for the whole family, there is over 70, maybe 75 by now, degrees in our family. So we have a lot of cousins, they're aunts and uncles now, to our nieces and nephews, who also are quite well educated. Our nieces and nephews are lawyers and teachers as well, social workers, and my own brothers and sisters, most of us did get degrees. That's my son Ted and me a couple years ago. And this is quite an interesting picture that showed up one year. This is my husband's family. My husband is Chinese, so where my children are mixed. This picture was taken in 1920, and that's the mother, the third person there sitting down. That was the grandmother, and right behind her is my husband's mother. And over on the right there, the grandfather, and on the right of him, or I guess it would be his left, but the lady standing up, that was his concubine. At that time, there was only one other man or one male in the family, so he took a concubine, and she had the boy on the right. So there were two sons now, because somehow the Chinese people still value sons over girls. I don't know why. Once you get a baby, you just love them. Your circle widens immediately. But and then that was why he took the concubine, because he wanted another son. And then the little baby that's sitting there in the front, Uncle Harvey, he was born after. So they had three sons in the family. And Harvey grew up to be, he was the world champion, a yo-yo world champion, actually, and he's very famous for that. Here's a picture of my husband and I when we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary, like 7 years ago. We'll be married 57 years now, next month. And here's something I'd like to share with you. Let us take care of the children, for they have a long way to go. Let us take care of the elders, for they have come a long way. Let us take care of those in between, for they are doing the work. And I think I dedicate this really to our frontline workers who really do need our support, and they're the first people there when tragedy happens to us in our communities. And I think it's vital, to talk about having a spiritual foundation. I've always been a Christian. My grandparents, my parents we always belonged to the Anglican Church, and this was one of the things I was so angry about when I finally went to university and I found out that they had 3 reasons for sending us to residential school and putting us on reserves, and that was for protection, assimilation, and civilization. And civilization to them meant that we become Christians and brown farmers. And I, at the time I said I didn't even have to go to residential school. None of us needed to, because we were already Christians. And so I had a hard time, forgiving that. But and I used to really resent my parents for, sending us to residential school, because I just thought they wanted to get rid of us. We were so many. But then as I started learning more at university, I realized that really they never would have traded my self-esteem for my becoming a Christian or learning to read and write and so on. It was all imposed on us. But I've remained Christian. I'm not a closet Christian. I still go to church every Sunday, and in fact, I healed myself from residential school through reading my Bible. And I used to tell people that God was my psychiatrist and the Bible was my model of intervention, because I really needed to get over the anger and the bitterness I felt. And gradually, I woke up one day and I realized I don't even feel angry anymore. And anger, creates all kinds of other problems. I used to yell at my children when they were young, and that wasn't, really good. Right away after I did it, I had to hug them and tell them I was sorry. Well, that, wasn't really a very good way for them, because it would be confusing for them. But when I connected it to, the anger, I felt it was because of how we were treated as young children, and that we were taken away from a loving environment and not really told why we were there and not shown much kindness. One woman, I always remember her, Mrs. Oakey, was the one who was the kindest, and thankfully we had her as a supervisor the first time we got there. And in all the years after that, she was really the only one who was ever kind. She never yelled at us, and she was already quite old when we were there, and she used to have this really loose neck, when you get old, and she used to let us, play with it at night, and and her arms, we used to go like this to her arms because they were all loose and everything, but she was always so kind, and I learned kindness from her. I think if she hadn't been there, many of us, as young children, would have been more devastated than we were. So, we just have to learn to not be defined by how we grew up and how people treated us. I mean, I still, resent that we're still discriminated against so much. But one of the things I've learned is that education does give you that confidence. You learn to speak out, and I know sometimes I'm told I make people uncomfortable because I speak out on these issues in public, but I said, well, I think I would be more uncomfortable if I allowed that misinformation to continue. And, we have to speak out because there's still a lot of injustices in our country. And we can't let them continue. So this prayer, is an example of how our ancestors prayed, I guess, before Christianity, that there's always still some elements that come in. Creator, open our hearts to peace and healing between all people. Creator, open our hearts to provide and protect for all children of the earth. Creator, open our hearts to respect for the earth and all the gifts of the earth. Creator, open our hearts to end exclusion, violence, and fear among all. Thank you for the gifts of this day and every day. So, I think back on some of the ways my grandparents prayed, and they were always starting out with, oh Lord, hear my voice and pity me because I have not been a good person. And, so they would go through it all, and then at the end they would say that, yet I know that, you are so good, you forgive us all that we do and help us to be stronger and better. And this prayer, I guess, was probably one of the first prayers that we learned in English, at residential school, the Lord's Prayer. And I used to teach that to my own children, and they learned it as very young children, and my granddaughter as well. So, and you can use all these prayers anytime during the day when you feel you need spiritual renewal. And this is a prayer, of course, that's quite common. That it used to be attributed to Chief Dan George, but later on I found out that it's actually a prayer from this Sioux chief, Yellow Hawk, and that one we know quite well. O great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I come before you, one of your children. I am small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made, my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may know the things you have taught my people, the lesson you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength not to be superior to my brothers, but to be able to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me ever ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. So those are, the ways that we pray. We always remember the land that strengthens us and gives us our foods, and then we ask for strength for ourselves. So I think empowerment. We went through that, and these are the many things that I've shared with you, what I've needed in my life and how to live a better life, and for myself and my children, and also in ways that I could reach my goals. You know, I was sharing that I left residential school in just starting grade 11, and then I had to go back and upgrade my skills in order to go to university. And then when I started university, everywhere place we moved, my husband moved quite a few times. I always went and tried to take one course along the way. Even when we lived in Belgium, the American University was there, so I took courses there. And at Carleton, when we lived there, because we went to Ottawa 3 times, and always trying to further my education goals until I came here to BC in 1984. Then I went, I had to go to 3 universities first to get all the courses I needed to go. So I was also on the highway driving from Chilliwack, where I lived, into BC to get the courses that I needed. And then finally I was accepted at UBC when I had enough credits to go into the School of Social Work. So that took me 2 years after I was in the school, and then I graduated and took my master's, and I'm very focused when I make a decision about reaching goals, and I finished my master's in 1.5 years. And then I went out to teach, and I really enjoyed it. And then when I came here to work, I decided to do a PhD, so that took me 3 years to do, because I was still working full-time, but I took 1 year off from work just to do the coursework and the comprehensive exams, and then went back to work. So it was, difficult, but I was focused on it, and I really had this goal that I had to finish this in 3 years, and so I managed to do it. So, empowerment is part of that, having the confidence to go out and do, what you, the vision that you have for your life and for yourself, and you can do it. So don't be afraid. I mean, when I finished my PhD, I was 62 years old, so it's never too late. and I hope, I've encouraged a lot of you to pursue your goals and empower yourself to be successful. I want to talk just one thing about reconciliation, because I think it's important that we always keep that focus in our minds after going through 7 years of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My sister was involved in it too the whole time. She was one of the elders. And I used to go to as many as I could just to support her, because it was really difficult for her to sit and listen in the circles, because they all had to do it that were on the committee, the commission, and listen to the stories. And so I went, and it was, even for me, it was difficult. I heard a lot of stories when I was giving workshops at one time, but I couldn't, believe some of the things that were shared at the Truth and Reconciliation circles. It was so devastating and heartbreaking. So we need to keep that in focus in the minds of all Canadians. If we want to have a better life, maybe 10, 15 years from now, we have to start educating the younger children about residential schools. And they're already doing that where I am in Richmond. We have a lot of teachers who have committed to it, and through that Aboriginal Enhancement Education Agreement, we're able to enlarge the curriculum to include that, and sort of make it so that not using the word mandatory, but encouraging the students to be there to do that. And the mandate for the Aboriginal Enhancement Education Agreement is to have more successful high school Aboriginal graduates. And this is the 10th year that we've been working on that, and already I noticed quite a change of how many high school students, this is in the city, that are graduating from high school. And so Reconciliation recommended 94 call to action topics. And I noticed that sometimes Nadine, she speaks quite a bit about the medical part of that, and I'm grateful that Dr. Nadine Karen is in such an influential position, because now she can influence her profession, and that's where we still need a lot of attention in our communities about our medical problems. And Dr. Evan Adams, I mean, he's reached such a high position too, where he's able to influence policy to create better health for our communities. And that was one of the things that I noticed when I used to read a lot of the health research reports, and they would make recommendations, but they weren't strong enough, and even though it was evidence-based research, rarely did any of those conclusions get translated into health policy or social policy. And those are the kinds of things that we need to speak out about whenever you can. If you hear misinformation, takes a lot of courage. It took me a long time before I got mad enough to stand up and say that's a big lie you're saying. That's not true. At first, some of the symptoms are that your tummy, you get this gut reaction, and then you start to shake. But then I think that's your body telling you gotta do this. You gotta get up and speak. So. If you get those symptoms when you hear something that isn't true, just get up and say it. You'll be shaking at first, but it's surprising how you do get used to it. And you're not so, afraid anymore to speak out about it. So we need to focus on reconciliation more. And yesterday I listened to the 6 Degree forum that was going on. It's going to go across Canada, and Adrian Clarkson was one of the moderators for it. And one of the men in the circle from the Yukon was talking about the 150th birthday this year of Canada, and he mentioned the fact that there's not much talk being expressed around reconciliation. He said, what are they pushing? Are we celebrating 150 years of colonization and not focusing on reconciliation? And I thought that was a pretty good comment, for him to make. Colonization is still a big part of our lives. All of the powers that were imposed upon us, they took over our lives, and we've let them, but now we have more educated people that can speak out. We can do something about it. So, okay, I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ng, for sharing so much wisdom and your personal journey. We do have some comments and questions on webinar that I'll start to read out to you. So Jennifer writes, thank you for sharing your stories and your wisdom with us. Leah Jones writes, Dr. Ng is a wonderful teacher, definitely an empowered woman. I agree with her recipes for helping empower women. Early childhood support, supporting parents and communities, reading and higher education, and family supports. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Ng.
Oh, thank you for that.
We have a question from Margot McCullen. She writes, do you have any advice for educators of elementary students? What would help the most with reconciliation?
Well, there's lots of material now that's being published, and I think even the curriculum in BC has, they're introducing more and more along that theme. And with very young children, they're very understanding and compassionate, and they're so sad when they hear the stories about what happened to children at residential schools. And, they can't imagine how they would ever manage to live without their mothers and fathers, at their age. So, that's the type of feelings, I guess, that we need to harness and beginning, the understanding of what happened to First Nations people, and what maybe their parents see. The children don't see that yet. I mean, they just look at us as older people or bigger people, but they don't associate, unkindness and things like that yet. But that would be a good place, to start. The Ministry of Education will have articles and curriculum already that you can use.
Thank you. I also want to ask if anyone on the video conference has any comments or questions. If so, you can take yourself off of mute. I think maybe one of the sites already is off of mute.
That would be us in La Causa. I just would like to say we really enjoyed the presentation. We're both frontline workers for our community, and just to hear all the comments and to be able to hopefully download this, I'm sure we can use it to our advantage. So thank you very much for your encouraging words.
Were you able to hear? So they were just saying thank you so much for your presentation, and they're both frontline workers in their community, and they really value the wisdom that you shared today. And yes, our video of this recording of this session will be available. And Dr. Ng, are you comfortable with sharing your PowerPoint slides as well?
Yes, it would be fine.
Okay, so we can share the slides as well. So, thank you so much for your comments. On webinar, Jeannie Parnell writes, thank you so much, Dr. Ng. Kathy writes, thank you so much, Dr. Ng. You've given me a lot of food for thought. Dr. Ng, I just wanted to ask you, you shared about your experience in residential schools and that it wasn't always easy. You did have one person that showed you kindness. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your experience in post-secondary education, some of your struggles or your successes there, and how that's driven you to really work on improving the experience of education for young learners.
Well, I think you should really pick subjects like political science and maybe sociology also, to give you a background of what society does to us. They re-socialize us as soon as we start school. And I notice even with my own children, by the time they were in grade 4, they had lost all their bubbliness. And I guess by being taught not to be outspoken or precocious, I guess. So, but society is how is people, and we learn how to react, or interact in society, and so that's all learned. But the wonderful thing about that is that you can actually unlearn and empower yourself, give yourself strength through the knowledge you're getting, and so you can use that in classes to speak out and just say how society has changed their way of thinking about different people. And I learned a lot in my political science courses when we studied policy and the impacts of that. So those two subjects, would be a good help. And and I used to get a lot of professors asking me questions about my culture and the First Nations people. And I got so that I just said, well, I'm not the teacher, you are. I think those are things you should learn. And so you get courage, I guess, to speak out about things that you don't feel that you should be the one teaching. I'm there to learn too. And it's difficult, if you haven't read, and you should, at university you should read all your required readings for sure, but if you need more background, you should also go into the recommended readings, because it always supplements the knowledge. And most of the time in your first couple of years at university, you can do most of your papers just reading the required and recommended readings without going out and reading other books to get the citations that you need. So I always think that, you know, to be successful, you have to be a reader, because it helps you to write well. That's really, you know, the main reward, I guess, or purpose of reading.
Thank you. I'll read out a few more questions and comments. Lorraine writes, Dr. Ng, thank you for encouraging me to speak up even when it feels uncomfortable. I have had that feeling in my gut, but it is so important to find our voices as women.
Good. That's wonderful. Keep it up.
Leah Jones writes, Dr. Ng, I am an RN, a registered nurse in Kelowna, BC, and I've done work and have always been fascinated by the concept of resiliency. The research says that it takes just one responsible adult role model to help empower a challenged child or teen to succeed in life.
Thank you for that.
Addie Price asks, how do you support community with literacy for their children when they themselves struggle? Education is so important, however, there are many communities that because of poverty are unable or don't access the resource. How can we support them?
Well, that's a good question to ask, and also, you know, I'm glad that people are thinking about that. Well, you know, it takes money to read, because you have to buy the books and maybe have somewhere to keep the books as well. But if you live somewhere where there is a library, I really would recommend you get a library card. It used to be that if you get a library card, you just need to have 2 pieces of identification, like envelopes with your address on it, because they're really more interested in the address. And, you know, use the library to borrow books as much as you can. But also I think it would be worthwhile going to your band counselors and you know, requesting that they start a library in your community. You know, you can start small. I know when I was in the Air Force, we started a library in one of the bases I was at, and that was before I was married. And it's amazing, we just sent some notices to some churches at that time, and we got boxes and boxes of books. They shipped them there to the base that I was at, and but we really didn't know how to categorize them. You know, nobody was a librarian, so we just, as best we could, put them alphabetically. But you know, you could do things like that. I think this is an age where people are just getting rid of books, discarding them, because everybody's using you know, the technology, Kindle and all of these other books now. So there's still probably a way that you can access all these books that are being thrown out, and you know, it just takes organizing, but there's a lot of people out there that are good at organizing and like to do it. So, but you know, to make it easier at first approach, I think you should approach your leadership and ask them how, you know, you could begin to help with reading skills in your community.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Leah writes, it sounds like there are some good mentors to help you through your challenges caused by residential schools. Do you think your dad's influence and other healthy adults helped you become the woman that you are today? Are most of the other female siblings as positive and successful as you?
Oh yes. You know, my father was, he was our tower of strength, and you know, and he walked with dignity no matter what people said or did to him. You know, he was always humble. And yes, in my family, the women, yeah, there's a lot of us that are educated, but also, you know, the men are, the younger generation as well, the young men are. You know, I think as I shared before, the way I've recognized women as having empowerment was when I went to live in the States. And this church that I went to, they had all of these women who were so well educated. I was so impressed. And it was the time of the civil rights movement, because it was in the 60s, and then these huge Vietnam War demonstrations. They, you know, we would go, I would go with them. I mean, I used to be scared at one time to do all that because there was so many police around, but it was the women who really inspired me. They were lawyers and doctors and just accountants. They were so educated. I was so impressed with them. And my sisters, you know, they still stay in their jobs because they want the Aboriginal content to remain in the college and universities. You know, we have to be so vigilant with all the ways that we try to advance, because as soon as the leadership goes, no one takes over, then those courses get wiped out. So, yeah, we still depend on strong women with good leadership skills.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ng. I raise my hands to you for the wisdom that you shared today and the time that you took to come here and join us today. Thanks everyone who participated on video conference and webinar. Thanks to the First Nations Health Authority eHealth team that helps us get set up with the video conference sites, and to the rest of the UBC Learning Circle team that helps us with the technical setup. And I just want to let everyone know that we have a few more Learning Circle sessions coming up in May that may be of interest to you. Next week on Thursday, May 4th, we have Kat Norris joining us for a second session on her story called Without Reservation, A Survivor Story. And so she'll go into more depth about her story as a residential school survivor and her healing journey. And on Tuesday, May 30th, at the end of the month, we'll have a session called Dollars and Cents, Financial Preparation for Post-Secondary Education. So if you or someone you know is interested in post-secondary funding, if you have any young learners in your family or your community that would benefit from this information, please join us for that session. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you all for listening, and you know, keep up the good work. I really admire you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.